I'm here with Joel Schuman. Joel, you gave the Schaefer lecture about the correspondence or non-correspondence or connection or disconnection between structural progression in glaucoma and functional progression, or progression on functional testing. There, I've said it in a very long-winded way. I'm sure that you can say it much better. Can I get you to flesh out what the subject is?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk with you about that. So what I talked about in the Schaefer lecture was the structure-function relationship. And specifically, we always think of structural change preceding functional loss, structural change being things like the optic nerve head or retinal nerve fiber layer or macular ganglion cell layer and interplexiform layer. And in certain situations, that's absolutely true in early disease. So in early disease, we see structural loss, which precedes functional loss measured by perimetry. But what I'm suggesting, our hypothesis is that the reason that there seems to be that disconnect, that temporal disconnect, is because the perimetry is less sensitive to abnormality and change than our structural measures. And so we can detect an abnormality or a change in retinal nerve fiber layer or the optic nerve well before we can detect a loss of visual function using perimetry. As the disease progresses and both the measures of structure and the measures of function are within their dynamic range or within a range where they're able to make measurements, those changes will occur at similar times. Once you're below the range where you can make structural measurements, structure will seem to be stable and you will continue to have functional loss. So this functional loss late in disease without structural loss and structural loss without functional loss early in disease, I'm suggesting are actually artifacts of how we measure structure and function in glaucoma. And what I presented in the Schaefer lecture were longitudinal data collected over as much as 17 years using optical coherence tomography and perimetry in order to identify the relationship between structure and function in glaucoma patients. And we had people with glaucoma suspects, and healthy individuals that we followed in this study, which we were very fortunate to have funded by the National Institutes of Health.
Interesting stuff. So let me make sure that I follow what you're saying. So when in early glaucoma, when there's progression that you can detect structurally, we're sort of below the threshold where we're going to pick things up on visual field testing. I mean, it's not that there aren't functional changes going on. It's just that we don't have the means to get a sensitivity that's that low.
Right. I think of that as above the threshold, but below the threshold would be another way of putting it. Yeah.
And then, but then there's middle range where we have glaucoma progression that's detectable on the visual field testing as perimetry progression. But at some point, our structural testing kind of maxes out. Not exactly, but once we get to an advanced state, the structural testing itself, in a way, becomes sort of less sensitive to change, to delta.
Yeah, so we call that a floor effect. Because the measurements become very noisy once the tissue gets quite thin. So many of the manufacturers don't have a readout below a certain thickness.
I understand what you're saying. And above that, we can still detect progression on visual field testing precisely for the same reason, that at that point, a limited nerve fiber layer loss is going to create a profound difference in the field test, even if it's above the floor or ceiling or whatever it is of the structural testing. But the thing is that I've seen patients with disc splinter hemorrhages. Right? That's a sort of a structural finding, and then I see the effect of splinter hemorrhage, that sort of corresponding nerve bundle loss, later. I don't see it at the same time.
Yes, and I think that that's a very good point. And so what we see when somebody has a disc hemorrhage is the hemorrhage occurs. It's sort of a red flag, if you'll pardon the pun. And then you see an enlargement of the retinal nerve fiber layer defect, or the development of a retinal nerve fiber layer defect if there wasn't one there before. And so you have this focal loss. And I think that we're talking about the same phenomenon in this case. It's not until enough neural tissue is lost that you can detect the functional abnormality that you'll be able to get the parametric change. In other words, a change on the visual field or an abnormality on the visual field, whereas your structural testing is more sensitive to that early change, and you can detect thinning of the retinal nerve fiber layer locally where the hemorrhage occurred, and you can see that on a red-free photograph or sometimes even on a color fundus photo.
I see. So that associated with a splinter hemorrhage, there is some structural change in the nerve fiber layer, but even that change is below the threshold at which I'm going to detect it with the field. However, in the context of the subsequent progression in the nerve fiber layer thinning, eventually that area is going to reach threshold before everything else does, and it's going to look like there's a temporal disconnect between the event of the splinter hemorrhage and its manifestation on visual field testing.
That's our hypothesis, yes.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff, Joel. Joel, thank you very much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.